Joining us. This is The World This Week in partnership with the International Herald Tribune. Eric Fanner is with us. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Judah Grunstein of World Politics Review, Nushabeh Amiri of Ruse Online, France 24's Loïc Berrou, at the time Washington correspondent for TF1, the French television station, from New York, Christopher Dickey of Newsweek magazine and the Daily Beast, author of Securing the City. And we're pleased to welcome to our set as well Ahmed Rashid, who joins us from Madrid. His books include Descent into Chaos, The United States and the Failure of Nation Building in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, as well as the book Taliban. Thanks for being with us. Ahmed Rashid, the day after September 11th, France's newspaper of record, Le Monde, which never pulls its punches when it comes to America, ran a front-page editorial entitled, "We are all Americans. Nous sommes tous des Américains." Can you remind us what happened next?
Well, the NATO, the Western Alliance, gave a similar message to the Americans. The Americans said, we don't need any help in going to war in Afghanistan. We want to go to war on our own, which is what happened. And at the same time, there was a lot of unrest in the Muslim world. And there were demonstrations in many Arab capitals, but particularly in Pakistan, where there was a lot of support and sympathy for Al-Qaeda and for the Taliban. And so for several weeks before the war started, the world was a very divided and fraught place. It was not that automatically everyone was supporting the hurt that had happened to America.
And two wars, of course, ensuing, the one in Iraq now being wound down. But if you recall, in those days after 9/11, you saw those young men and women wanting to enlist, going, for instance, to the Army recruitment office in Times Square. We all remember those images, Loïc nodding his head there. Well, guess what? Those soldiers, they're still there.
Still kind of our war as far as the young people of America, you know what I mean? And like it's really overlooked now, which I think is kind of, you go home and a lot of people don't really know that Afghan really exists.
Christopher Dickey, that soldier, a native New Yorker, interviewed in Afghanistan's Helmand province a few days ago. Have Americans almost forgotten they're still fighting a war in Afghanistan?
Well, I wouldn't say they've forgotten it, but they're not focused on it. They feel that the war is winding down there. They hope it is anyway. And they certainly think it's winding down in Iraq as far as they're concerned. These were not long war. These were not planned as long wars by the American people. Nothing that the Bush administration told them suggested this was going to be a sort of endless combat in faraway lands against a relatively small number of people who were obviously much poorer than America was. And I don't think Americans have really understood for a long time why we have stayed and stayed and stayed in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Part of the problem, and maybe Ahmed would agree with this, maybe he wouldn't, but part of the problem in 2001 and 2002 was that the sense of hurt done to the United States was so enormous, and the initial war against the Taliban was so easy. It was over in a matter of weeks. They were out of power, they were gone, they were on the run, bin Laden was fleeing, and it just didn't seem to square with the amount of anger that existed in the United States. That's one reason that the Bush administration was able to go ahead a year and a half later and mount the whole campaign to go to war against Iraq, seen as a rather bigger country and portrayed as a more menacing country. The whole psychology of the U.S. logic of war at that time, now you look back on it and it looks silly, and you wonder why we've allowed it to continue for 10 years. But people are not forgetting that we're involved in these countries. I'd say rather they just would like to forget that we're involved.
Judah Grunstein.
Well, I'd just add to what Christopher said, not only were they not sold as or expected to be long wars, they've turned into exactly the kind of wars that George Bush, as a candidate, promised he would not engage in. I remember at one of the presidential debates, he said America would pursue under his administration a humble foreign policy and not engage in nation building. And what ended up happening was through the miscalculations of the war planning, especially for the Iraq War, they ended up with a quick regime change and no plan for how to manage the country afterwards. And that's where the 10 years since then, or the 9 years since then, have come in. And that's where the war fatigue on the part of the American people has set in. That's why there's this real desire to wind them down. And if anything, it's been the U.S. military that's wanted to not wind them down prematurely, so that the military can leave with a narrative of victory after investing so much blood and treasure into the wars.
Another point, and here's a question that all our panelists are familiar with. Did you pack these bags yourself? Did anyone provide you with gifts on the way to the airport? The question I want to ask is, when you, Nushabeh Amiri, when you see the long lines, when you go to airport security, do you sometimes get the sense that, well, on that score, bin Laden won?
Well, you see, sometimes I think that the American, they used to ignore us as the foreigners. I mean, they were engaged with their own life, and now they are afraid of us, and that's why they behave in different ways. And
We have to go through those same lines at the airport security, by the way.
And more awful. I mean, I was invited to the USA, and then we were there for 5 hours, and they did all sort of action and questions and so on, and at the same time, you know, something which is happening which is very interesting. You know, if you see the American film, serial in television, now you see always there is an Iranian who is a terrorist. There is an Arab who is a terrorist, and there's a nice American who is trying to help him to get his own right. You know, what personally I think is that they're putting pressure on me as a citizen of these countries, instead of doing the other thing. Yeah, it has been always very difficult, and that's why I've decided not to go there like that, because it's humiliating.
Ahmed Rashid, one of the first things after the September 11th attacks was George Bush going to a mosque in Washington and preaching tolerance. But do you agree with Nushabeh that now that sort of the narrative of the evil Muslim persists in the eyes of Americans?
Well, you know, I mean, I think it's changed, but I mean, what you're seeing now in the United States is homegrown terrorism. You're seeing Muslim Americans or converts to Islam in America for the first time carrying out acts of terrorism. Now, this was not something that happened right after 9/11 for many years. This is a very recent phenomenon. And there was, I think, a very hateful campaign right after 9/11. A lot of Muslims were deported, were imprisoned. Anyone without their visas or without their passports in due order were treated very badly. I think all that has improved quite a lot. But of course, what there is now, and what has replaced it in Muslim societies across the big cities of America, is a very pervasive intelligence system where the FBI are hiring or recruiting young Muslims to report on other Muslims as to what they're doing. So there's a lot of suspicion and mistrust in these communities, especially the poorer communities, and not the well-off Muslims who are doctors and lawyers and professionals, but the poorer communities.
And as the panel's been saying, or as the point made by Loic before the break, how the image of America to the rest of the world has had its ups and downs since then, the U.S. electing its first black president. And remember his very first executive order.
We then provide the process whereby Guantanamo will be closed no later than 1 year from now. This executive order. There we go.
Promise. Today, Guantanamo is still open for business. In our Wednesday Google Plus Hangout, here's what Paul from Hong Kong had to say about that unkept promise.
My own personal feeling on Guantanamo is that I've always been an advocate for due process in any form. And the fact that these people are they're not going under a military tribunal, they're not going under a civil trial of any kind. It's just at some point when this is all resolved, I don't know when that's going to be, this is going to be another black spot of history for America, just like the Japanese internment camps were for Japanese Americans in World War II.
Eric Fanner, do you agree with that?
Well, clearly Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib as well. I mean, the pictures coming out of there were devastating for the U.S. image. I mean, on top of what had already happened in Iraq, I think people throughout the world would have gone along with Afghanistan, but Iraq was devastating. Then you had that on top of it. And the problem was it spread the mistrust of America far beyond the Muslim world. I mean, if you look at the image of America over those years, the way it tracked in Europe was down in the single digits, right? And approval ratings. And Obama has brought some of that back, certainly across Europe, France and Germany and other places where mistrust was very high. It's improved back to sort of. But not in the Muslim world. It has stayed down even with Obama. There was a brief blip, but now it's back at the same levels it was in 2003, 2004, and that's the lasting legacy.
I just want to really highlight something that you said in mentioning the Arab Spring and how much that changes the way in which we can assess 9/11 now on this anniversary as opposed to even a year ago. If you look at the strategic logic of Al-Qaeda and of Osama bin Laden, it was that for Muslims and for Arabs to overthrow Arab governments, they needed to first weaken the United States because the United States was the security backstop for those governments. And if you look at what's happening in the Arab Spring, even given all of the uncertainty that still exists, and even given the criticisms of whether the revolutions or just shifts in leadership figures, what's happened is that the center of gravity in Arab politics is now in Arab capitals. The United States is an observer.
They control their own destiny.
I saw it written that they've re-entered history in the sense that they are actors in their own story. But it's important because the United States is an observer, maybe an influential observer, but it's not. The United States is no longer the key actor in that story, and I think that changes a lot in terms of the Muslim world's relationship to the United States.
Like in Libya, for instance. Yeah.
Ahmed Rashid, are you surprised that we're not hearing "Down with America" in any of these protests that are happening all across the Arab world?
Well, I think the amazing thing is, as these speakers have said, that America doesn't appear in the Arab Spring, in that sense. What President Obama says or doesn't say has not been critical to some of these dictators being toppled by the crowds in the street or by young people. This is very much their own thing. And they're not, preoccupied with what the Americans are saying or doing. Now, of course, many Americans have read this to mean that, well, this is the end of American power, this is the end of American hegemony. But in a way, I mean, I see it that, these young people have come out after 30, 40 years of a single regime rule, and they are most concerned about themselves and their own countries, rather than what the international community is talking about. So this is a very big difference from what happened, say, during the Cold War or what happened immediately after 9/11. I think we're going to see more and more of this around the world. We're going to see countries doing things or people doing things where they will not be following any lead or really caring very much about what the Americans have to say.
Loïc Béraud.
Yeah, I will also mention or underline that the very cautious approach that the Obama administration had of the Libyan war also allowed Europe to play a bigger role, which is pretty amazing to see the French and the Brits actually leading a military operation with military American support, of course, but Europe has a bigger role to play, including in the Middle East peace process, maybe.
All right, part of that multipolar world. I've got a question for Christopher Dickey in New York, which is, you remember before men landed on the moon, this was a huge deal. After it happened, not such a big deal. Osama bin Laden being killed. Is it going to be it seems as though right now it happened in the month of May, and it's almost an afterthought at this point, and we're only in September.
Well, I think that's right. The news cycle moves so quickly these days that almost anything that happens seems to sort of disappear from the public consciousness very quickly. I mean, one of the things that's striking about 9/11 itself is how long the image of the towers coming down has stayed with us, and how striking an image that is. But once people understood that bin Laden was this little old man in his nasty little apartment in Pakistan, watching movies and hoping to overthrow governments around the world, they sort of put him into a realistic scale, I think, and he doesn't seem so important anymore as an individual. I think it would actually help if people began to understand that that's generally true of Al-Qaeda, that the greatest mistake that was made was to put Al-Qaeda on a par as a power with the United States or with Europe. It's always just been a relatively small collection of lunatics espousing a radical ideology that very, very few people actually subscribe to. And I think one of the great mistakes of the last 10 years was to inflate its importance. So if people are forgetting Osama bin Laden, good. That's exactly what he deserves.
By the way, Christopher Dickey, somebody's been reading your prose. You penned an article at the start of the week warning that the next 9/11 is going to be natural disasters. Well, in a summer where the U.S. has been hit by hurricanes, floods, and earthquakes, the Atlantic Journal-Constitution's Mike Lukovich depicts a White House briefing where you see the general saying, "We're searching for Mother Nature in Pakistan" to President Obama. We're almost out of time. Judah Grunstein, what's the next 9/11 in your view?
I didn't even want to weigh in on that. I think that the essence of 9/11 was the fact that it was something that no one imagined was possible, and it played out on the television screens and in New York for New Yorkers in front of them, and I don't think that we're capable really of imagining the next 9/11 or the next Berlin Wall for that matter. These events where they happen, where from one day to the next or from one moment to the next, the world as we knew it and the structure of even of our imaginations have been radically altered and radically changed. So where that will come, the nature of that event is that we don't know.
Brooklyn-born Judah Grunstein, thanks for being with us. I want to thank Loic Béot, Noushadeh Amiri, Eric Fanner, Christopher Dickey for joining us from New York, and Ahmed Rashid for joining us from Madrid here in the world this week. Stay with us. Of course, our 9/11 coverage will continue throughout the weekend. And coming up next, you're on France 24. It's time for business.
France 24 on your iPad. Keep up to date on international news in real time, whether you're at home or on the move. France 24's worldwide coverage now on your iPad. Reports from the field, debates, interviews, accessible anywhere, anytime, and it's all free. France 24 on the iPad. The news, wherever and whenever you want it. Years ago, airplanes crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Another crashed just short of its target in Washington thanks to the bravery of passengers on board. That morning, the world changed. France 24 looks back on the 10 years and the events that have marked the world since September 11th, 2001. Don't miss our special edition live from Ground Zero with our guests and special correspondents, starting at 2:30 p.m. Paris time on September 11th. 2001-2011, 10 years on from September 11th on France 24.